Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. No Tom Slater this week, but I am delighted to be joined by Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
And trade unionist Paul Embery.
Hello.
Absolutely loads to discuss today. We'll be talking about Labour's Islamic blasphemy law, the reform surge in the polls, and Trump's ban on men in women's sports. Before we get into all that, I just wanted to remind everyone that Spiked supporters can come to Spike's 25th anniversary bash. It's on Thursday, the 27th of February, and you can get your tickets now if you're a Spike supporter by logging into the supporters hub, or look out for it on the website. So get your tickets now before it's too late. Has the UK suddenly ended up via the back door with Islamic blasphemy laws? Two things happened this week. One was the conviction of a man of a hate crime for burning the Quran in Manchester. Also, we learned about Angela Rayner's plans as community secretary to set up a council that will define Islamophobia, which many critics warn is essentially going to bring in Islamic blasphemy law via the back door. It will essentially allow criticism of Islam to be banned. Ella, what have you made of this week's developments? Should we be worried?
Well, definitely. There's already a pretty bad kind of climate of discussion around Islamophobia. It's not like at the moment there's great freedom of speech and this is now going to pose threats to it. Obviously, what happened in Manchester with that individual being arrested shows that there's already a problem with a sort of quasi-blasphemy law. But the way in which Angela Rayner has gone about talking about this seems to me to be, a massive kind of basic virtue signal. This sort of, we're doing something in capital letters about Islamophobia. And if you look at the detail, number one of the people shortlisted to be on this committee, so presumably having a quite large amount of influence on how Islamophobia would be defined, is a man, a Leeds imam called Qari Asim, who one is on record for supporting the protest against the Lady of Heaven, which was that film we covered it on Spiked quite extensively, critical of the Prophet Muhammad or depicted him in a certain way, and there were mass protests about it. So supported that. Not great on free speech. Then if you look at the wider sort of feeling about this within the Labour Party, there was this quite remarkable thing that happened in the Commons, I think it was a few weeks ago, where Labour MP Tahir Ali asked an outrageous question, said that would the government take steps towards preventing the desecration of religious texts, which, would be exactly what happened in Manchester now. And Keir Starmer pointedly did not respond to it. He said something, but he didn't come out and say, no, because we don't live in a country that supports that kind of thing. So, this is all really bad news. Not because I think it would be a fantastic thing for you to do to go out on a Saturday morning and burn the Quran, but because the wider implications are, at a time when there are some quite serious cultural tensions around this issue, a government is basically making signs that it's going to come in and protect in a way that's different to any other religion, this particular one. It's going to it's going to be bad for free speech, but it's also sending a particular kind of message at a time that's significant.
Definitely. And it's, everyone can deplore prejudice against Muslims, bigotry against Muslims, discrimination against Muslims, but it seems as if every attempt to define Islamophobia inevitably brings in, or essentially forbids, criticism of ideas, criticism of a religion, which is something, Paul, that we thought we'd consigned to the past. Blasphemy laws were officially outlawed or officially dropped in 2008, I believe. And yet we're bringing them back under the guise of hate speech or, those kinds of ideas.
Well, I reject the term Islamophobia. I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said it was a junk term. The whole meaning of phobia means to have an irrational fear of something. I think people can be critical of Islam, particularly radical Islam, without necessarily being imbued with some sort of irrational fear of it. And my position is quite simple. I don't believe that any ideology, whether it's a religious ideology or a political ideology, should be ring-fenced from criticism or scrutiny or mockery, actually, for that matter. Because the truth is that ideologies, political, religious ideologies, including Islam, are quite bold about telling the rest of us how we should live our lives. what is right from wrong. And therefore, the ideology itself, I think, and those who proselytize for it, should have their ideas tested and their ideas challenged. And I think we've got to be free to do that. But I think what we are doing in this country, and we do seem to have a de facto blasphemy law, and that's because we've essentially given in to theocratic bullies. That's the truth of it. Those who shout loudest and complain most when their particular belief system is, in their view, insulted or even criticised or attacked in some other way, seem to get the authorities time and again to indulge them and to dance to their tune. And I think what happened in Manchester with the arrest of this guy who burnt the Quran, which I don't think is a particularly clever thing to do, by the way. I don't believe you should gratuitously go around offending people. I'm not saying there should be a law against that, but I don't see why anyone would want to do it gratuitously. But the response to it by the police, I think, was completely wrong. And these, the police in this country, when it came to the rape gangs, for example, including Greater Manchester Police, were pretty useless. When it came to the Batley school teacher, who is still in hiding to this day, as far as I'm aware, there's never been an arrest for that. And the police, I saw the statement that the police released after the guy in Manchester was arrested, and they did all the stuff about our diverse communities and all of that sort of stuff. But they said that the act was likely to cause distress and that people were likely to be offended by it. But for me, that isn't a good enough reason to start arresting people and throwing them in a cell. The fact that someone might be caused distress, if you allow that to become the established norm where people can simply say, I was distressed by what this person said, it was critical of my particular belief system, then you're essentially allowing someone what's called a heckler's veto. They simply say, I'm distressed and I'm offended, I want that person arrested. It's chilling and it's wrong, and the arrest should never have happened.
Definitely.
You have to look at the double standards because it is remarkable. I mean, outside Dawson Junction Station where I live, and it's the same outside Brixton, there are these, I don't know, kind of quasi-preachers who have got their little stall and they're constantly through a loud hailer talking about women. They love talking about women and how we're so immodest, and they smile at me because I'm usually wearing some kind of sack pushing the buggy, but but every other woman in Dalston who's scantily dressed is in danger of her mortal soul and all the rest of it. And it's relatively offensive a lot of the time and it offends my liberal attitudes against sexism. But because it's a mini kind of speaker's corner outside Dawson Junction, I'm not calling any police. It's absolutely fine. But if it was the other way around, and if it was someone criticising, even at the moment, criticising Islam or talking, maybe even calling it sexist, whatever it was, then the police would hear about it. And so I think you have to kind of, it's not sort of play culture wars with it, but the double standard says something about how there was that approach to the grooming gang scandal, that approach to the Batley School scandal, as Paul's already said. All these things reveal a kind of, if there ever was a phobia or an irrational fear, it's from a kind of a government which isn't willing to stand up for the principles and the cultures of its own country, which is supposed to be freedom of speech, open discussion, tolerance actually meaning something, rather than this sort of a kind of capped-offing to zealots.
And to religious sensitivity. I mean, it's worth saying that what you've just said, Ella, would make you an extremist in the eyes of the Home Office for bringing up something akin to two-tier policing. And even, you've both mentioned grooming gangs. According to the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, their definition of Islamophobia, which looks very likely to be what Angela Rayner bases her definition on, says that talking about grooming gangs is potentially Islamophobic. Talking about sexism in Islam is potentially Islamophobic as well. So, it's not even just that we're protecting the holy texts of Islam via a blasphemy law. It's like anything and that could be tangentially related to Islam, and even its most extreme manifestation suddenly has this warning sign over it now, saying you shouldn't go there, you shouldn't criticize it, and that's obviously incredibly dangerous.
Well, look, if people in a free society, want to follow a particular creed and to dedicate themselves to that creed and to the scripture within it, and they want to live their lives according to it, then on a private level, crack on. I absolutely defend the liberty of people to do that. But what I don't accept is when people say that I should afford the same level of veneration or respect to a particular creed because they attach such respect to their belief system, and they worship it in the way that they do, and it means so much to them. It doesn't mean that it has to mean so much to everybody else. And I stress again, that doesn't mean that people should gratuitously offend. But it does mean that people should be allowed to criticize. It does mean that people should be allowed to scrutinize. And in a country that, as once upon a time, was proud of its satire, if you go back to Punch magazine and even in the modern day Private Eye and Have I Got News for You and things like that, the idea that any belief system should be protected from that treatment is wrong, and I think actually inimical to our traditions. As a society.
Definitely. Before we move on, I did want to bring up one piece of good news that's perhaps cutting against the ties. People may have seen that a man called Jamie Michael was acquitted this week. He was arrested in the wake of the Southport stabbings. He posted a video on Facebook in which he talked about immigration and Islam, many beliefs that I would absolutely not endorse, but nevertheless, you would assume that it's his right to freedom of speech. The CPS really went after him. They insisted that this was worth prosecuting for stirring up racial and religious hatred. That it didn't matter about his Article 10 rights to free speech on the ECHR, but he has been freed. It took about 17 minutes for a jury to deliberate and to decide that he was not guilty. So, Ella, I guess there are maybe some bulwarks of free speech, maybe some common sense to be found in the general public, even if we don't find it in the political class or in the police or in the prosecutors.
Well, these individuals like Jamie Michaels are the sort of test on the sort of very baseline of whether you are allowed to say what you want. And the whole argument of sort of stirring up hatred, of misinformation, all the rest of it. I mean, one, the government doesn't have a leg to stand on that, because we know that the way in which the discussion about the Southport murders was conducted, the arguably the kind of deliberate mishandling of information.
Yeah, withholding of information.
Withholding of misinformation, if you want to go as far as saying sort of misleading the public and not responding to some of the information that was out there. Who did more damage to that discussion? People like Jamie Michaels, who, anyone can post sort of daft things on YouTube and all the rest of it. There's 1,000,001 people with wild opinions out there, but they're not going to have that much of an effect. Who can have an effect is the government, and what they allow to be discussed.
This episode of the Spike podcast is sponsored by Proton Mail. Now, chances are you probably don't spend loads of time thinking about your email security or privacy, and to be honest, I didn't either. But that was until I learned how easy it is for big tech to snoop on what I thought were my private email correspondences. After that wake-up call, I made the switch to Proton Mail. Proton is the world's largest secure email service, and its number one priority is privacy and security. Now I can rest assured that only me and the person I'm writing to can see my emails. In fact, Proton takes privacy so seriously that even they can't read my correspondence. Proton also has loads of other benefits, like cleansing your emails from irritating spam. Because of its unique fish guard mechanism, all scams are blocked before they even get to you. It's also just much more slick than the competitors too. There are no adverts cluttering up my inbox or dodgy attempts by companies to get their hands on my data. I'll always trust a business who shares my values. And just like Spiked, Proton is a fierce defender of free speech, privacy, and it loves to push back against big tech. By switching to Proton, I know I'm with a company that has my back. So, take back control of your inbox today. Go to proton.me/spikedpodcast or click on the link in the description below to switch to Proton Mail and receive a 38% discount. So, that's proton.me/spikedpodcast to experience true email privacy. Let's move on to talk about the the government's woes. I mean, perhaps the clearest sign of this, of Labour's difficulties, is the fact that we first had the first YouGov poll with reform coming on top. Paul, do you think, I mean, this is a sign of that Keir Starmer is, all is not well in Keir Starmer's camp?
Yeah, I mean, Labour has certainly sunk in terms of its popularity since the election in a way that I don't think anyone anticipated. I mean, there was talk they were going to get the difficult decisions out of the way early, and they tried to do that with the budget and so on. But I don't think anyone truly foresaw the level to which they've sunk in the polls, nor the level to which reform has risen so quickly. And I tweeted this morning, actually, I genuinely think we could be seeing the end of the Conservative Party as a serious political force in this country. I don't think I've ever said that before, and I know things fluctuate, but there does seem to be something going on. There does seem to be quite a serious realignment going on. And I think the fact that reform are winning so many working class votes as well.
Yeah.
The C2DEs, the occupational working class, and so on. I think is very interesting. Reform came second in 98 constituencies in the general election in July. 89 of those were Labour constituencies, and 60 of those were in the north of England. Lots of them traditional red wall, what you might call post-industrial Britain, and so on. And therefore, Labour, I think, has got a real problem. And I grew up in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, traditional Labour territory. And in 2006, I was living there when the BNP came out of nowhere and won 12 seats on the council, their best ever result in local government. I was active politically at the time. And so I've got an idea as someone involved with the Labour movement. I know why traditional Labour voters end up voting for right-wing parties. It's because if their own party, who they see as their own party, the Labour Party, doesn't deliver for them in terms of economic security on the one hand, and, if you like, cultural security on the other hand, then they become very disorientated, they become very bewildered, and they are inclined to throw in their lot with, if you like, populist parties who come along and say, we get you in a way that those establishment politicians don't. And the Labour Party, I don't think, has understood that for the last 25 years, particularly since the turn of the century, since we've seen the impact of what you might call the new global market, globalisation, the effects of that taking hold in working class communities, mass deindustrialisation in these places, people feeling that they've been abandoned, at the same time, very rapid and far-reaching demographic change. And by and large, these are people who are broadly tolerant. They're not opposed to immigration. They know the world changes, but they just feel that establishment politicians, including the Labour Party, have just completely forgotten about them. And I detect even now, despite what Keir Starmer has said over recent years about reconnecting with the Red Wall, I detect that they still don't trust the Labour Party on some of those fundamental issues. So there's something happening, I think.
Definitely. And it seems as if there's a lot of areas where you could say the Labour Party is just completely out of touch with the public. I mean, you think about some of the net zero policies that are leading to outright deindustrialisation. I mean, one issue, maybe a small issue in the grand scheme of things, but the Chagos Islands question has flared up again. Many people might not be at the top of their list of things to care about, but many people are baffled as to why the government seemingly has an endless money pit to give to a foreign country, and in order so that they will take away our territory. I mean, people are scratching their heads about over that. The only explanation seems to be that Labour is wedded to rule by lawyers. It fetishises international law over and above pretty much everything else, over and above connecting with voters, over and above the national interest. What do you make of that, Ella?
I don't think the Labour Party is out of touch with your average working man and woman. I think they don't want to be in touch with them. I don't think it's a mistake. And the Chagos Islands is a really good example of that, because this all hinges, this sort of, people are describing it as insane, this sort of mad plan that pleases no one, not least the Chagosians, who have been completely ignored, not consulted by the government, boxed out, and supposed to be happy with now being under the rule of Mauritius. No one is pleased by this, and the whole thinking behind it is a vanity project by Keir Starmer, who is obsessed with being liked on the international stage. It's all based on a ruling from the International Court of Justice, opinion, sorry, not a ruling.
Yeah,
so,
non-binding opinion.
You know, and the argument is, oh, we can't be serious players on the global stage if we ignore the ICJ. And, you know, I mean, it comes back to that thing that we love quoting on Spiked of, you know, Keir Starmer saying that he prefers Davos to Westminster.
Yeah.
Because it's just so telling. It's just, this is what this guy likes. He likes the applause in the conference centres, in the lovely air-conditioned rooms. He likes being, you know, on top of all with his lawyers and being Mr. Liberal. And, you know, it plays into the whole kind of, you know, decolonisation, fashionable kind of look. Oh, we're such a right-on party. But I mean, it's decolonisation with no plus sides for the colonised.
Yeah.
Again, the Chagossians really don't like this. In fact, there's a group of them who are trying to bring a court case to halt this deal completely. But, you know, whether it's the cost of it or the sort of the narrative that it tells of Labour Party being this sort of, you know, extremely elitist, I think, organisation full of people who don't care about what happens in the average day of the average voter, is why people aren't interested in them. And, you know, I don't see any road forward with its current attitude of ever being in touch with people. Why would you ever trust what the Labour Party is doing? If you look at things like, you know, Kim Ledbetter trying to open up, or rather trying to close down discussion about the assisted dying bill, possibly the most morally contentious thing that a government could ever lay its hands on, and, you know, could change the lives of individual people, or you know, everyone, if you have a dying relative. You know, the way in which she's going about that is by trying to make discussions of it in Parliament behind closed doors. So no public scrutiny in what's supposed to be a free and open democratic country. You know, even the recent sort of slightly nonsense story about the whole voice coach thing in lockdown, and, you know, who cares about that? But again, the whole way in which it was handled, and Keir Starmer getting very ruffled about the fact that someone dares to question his, you know, conduct during lockdown. It's just, none of it to me tells a story of a government that wants to hear from its people, the people, the citizens who put it in power. And so I kind of don't care. I don't care that they're not in touch. I don't think they want to be in touch. I'm kind of interested in reform in the sense that it's a party that has gone from having sort of almost no base. It's almost like was a stage party, you know, Farage with the big flares and all the kind of, you know, the big parties that they had, and it was all quite showy, to now sort of almost in reverse becoming kind of grassroots in a way that's sort of interesting. And, you know, it needs to get more serious about its you know, functioning as a party and an organisation. But in terms of providing a bit of space for a different conversation in Parliament, I mean, even the sort of handful of MPs they have ask more questions, I think, like, than anyone else combined. They're like, you know, dedicated to their jobs as politicians. Something to be said for that.
I think people have been complaining that on the Labour bench they ask too many questions, which you think it's their job to do that. Paul, I did want to ask you about the sort of voice coach gate, if you can even call it that. This, of course, relates to the voice coach visiting Keir Starmer on Christmas Eve 2020, when we would have been in a kind of lockdown. London was in, to use the jargon back then, tier 4 lockdown. Again, I often think that really the rules were the problem, not the rule breakers. But certainly Starmer, you know, used a lot of tried to hang Boris Johnson for being a rule breaker. He was a big advocate of lockdown, presented himself as whiter than white on these issues, quite similar to almost Lord Ali Gates as well. You know, it's the Tories who are corrupt. Button wouldn't melt in my mouth, but suddenly there's a scandal attached to Starmer. What do you make of all that?
Well, I think on one level, it is just so tedious, the fact that we, you know, as a nation, we're debating the question of whether or not a voice coach happened to visit the Prime Minister on a particular day. But it shows the absurdity of lockdown, that it has forced these sorts of debates, even now, a long time after lockdown. It's still on the agenda. But, you know, the truth is, if you if you live by the sword, you've got to die by the sword. And Starmer and co. made merry hell out of the fact that Johnson and Sunak broke the rules. So you can't then complain if the spotlight is turned on you. I mean, I always felt that with these rules, if we were going to have the rules, it was natural that from time to time, even people in positions of authority were going to slip up, because it's all very new. And, people didn't always know exactly what the restrictions were, and people were trying to live their lives and so on. And if we were going to have the rules, we should have treated it sensibly, like someone, if they breached the rules by meeting someone unintentionally, they breached the rules by meeting someone when they shouldn't have done. It should almost have been treated like, you got done speeding at 36 miles an hour in a 30 miles an hour zone. That would have been the sensible approach. But politicians were looking to kick lumps out of each other and looking to make political capital out of each other. So you saw this accusatory atmosphere where politicians were almost looking for other politicians to slip up and to say, it's disgraceful, you slipped up, you're killing our granny, and stuff like that. And Starmer, unfortunately, was part of that accusatory mood. So I don't really have much sympathy for him, that the spotlight has been turned on him. But I still think the bigger question on lockdown is the fact that we are still, and I think for many years to come, we'll be paying a very heavy bill for it that I think few people predicted at the time. I think, as a society, we treated it like the Black Death, when in fact it was a very nasty disease. There's no question about that. Very nasty virus that was potentially fatal for a small number of people, relatively speaking. And absolutely right, in a civilized society, you should try to shield those people as much as possible. But I still can't get out of my head the fact that we quarantined effectively the whole country for a virus that actually was only a serious threat to a small number of people. And when you look at what Sweden did, where they took a much softer approach, and I think that the data proves that actually for that, they weren't in the long term as a society any worse off, and probably have come out of it better than us. Yeah. Those are the big questions, and we shouldn't lose sight of those questions in all of the minutiae around, Starmer and his voice coach.
Definitely. You've got to laugh though. Starmer made himself Mr. Perfect. He advertised himself as Mr. Perfect.
Mr. Rules.
And Tories were bad enough, but I mean, passes for glasses, getting basically the entirety of Sue Gray's family some kind of position in government somewhere. The list goes on and on. I mean, this government is shady, and possibly in ways that are more politically significant than the previous one. And that's, as Paul says, the voice coach thing, lockdowns. There hasn't been much about it in the press, which is an interesting thing. And maybe it's just because COVID doesn't sell papers anymore. Maybe it's because the commentariat don't like criticising Mr. Perfect. But that aside, I think the bigger issue is that this is a government that has sold itself on being to the letter on the rules, and has from day one gone about being, the most kind of in sordid ways rule breaking than possibly the previous one.
This episode of the Spike podcast is also sponsored by Shopify. I don't know if you've ever had the sense that everyone around you is starting their own business or getting their own side hustle, as the kids call it. I've certainly had that feeling. Loads of people I know are ditching the 9-to-5 to start their own business to enjoy their own freedom. Now, if you've got a business idea but you don't know how to go about it, then I suggest you listen to this. That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one e-commerce platform to start, run, and grow your dream business. Whether you're selling skincare or software, Shopify makes selling online and in person as easy as you like, no matter how much you know about business. One of the best things about Shopify is that it covers every single one of your sales channels. It even gets your products out there on those crucial social media platforms like Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. And once the sales start rolling in, Shopify makes getting paid incredibly easy by accepting all payment types. It removes so much annoying admin, so you can focus on what really matters, your product and your customers. And if you're a bit of a digital nomad, you want to work from home or abroad, then you'll also love Shopify's central dashboard. It allows you to manage orders, shipping, payments, everything important for your business, literally anywhere around the world. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up now for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Right, let's talk about Trump's latest executive order. He has signed an order banning males from women's sports, essentially in federally funded sports, so that's mostly schools and universities. But he's also planning to get various athletics associations to change the rules. It could even affect the LA Olympics. He wants to urge the IOC to change their rules, and he's even promised to ban athletes who, as he puts it, fraudulently claim to be women when they are men. Now, Ella, one of the striking things about this was, first of all, the clarity of the language. He doesn't mince his words. He doesn't say trans women. He says men. And the second thing is, like, how has it fallen to Donald Trump to be the defender of women and girls' sports? That it shouldn't have come to this.
Yeah, it's a remarkable announcement about something that should be so unremarkable. That you have, particularly in schools, that you have a very clear distinction between boys and girls and the things that they do differently in sport. And, you know, he likes to put on a good show. When he was signing the executive order, he's in this room surrounded by all these girls who are, you know, waiting to applaud him at the right time and everything. But, you know, the thing is, it's a bit different to in this country because, you know, PE is something that we're all forced to do. And in America, sport in schools is a massive deal. You know, it can lead on to, you know, lots of kids use it to get into college on scholarships and things like that. It's a really big thing and has been, you know, quite significantly affected by the introduction of the trans issue, of primarily of allowing boys who are, you know, maybe they genuinely are wanting to be trans, but a lot of the time feeling sorry about the fact that they're low down in the league tables in the male category, who then try to become the hero in the female category because obviously they can run faster, jump higher, blah, 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 all the rest of it than all the girls. And it's, you know, if you care about sport, which it has to be said, I don't very much, but but if it is your passion and your talent and you are a young girl who wants to be the, you know, Olympic champion in swimming or anything else, it's soul destroying to know that you're not able to do that because you're constantly, you know, fairness is non-existent. So it's just kind of a no-brainer, but it is revolutionary at a time when America, you know, under the Biden administration and previous administrations had allowed some, you know, dramatic changes in relation to not just sport, but also in education, but, you know, dramatic changes to the way in which kids in particular engage with sports. So, you know, you don't have to be a fan of Trump, I'm not, to know that this is just a kind of common sense move. And I think it will, that the interesting thing will be how it will be received in America, because I have a feeling that even the most sort of liberal right-on parents out there will have been pissed off by the fact that their little girl wasn't able to get on. So it could be very popular.
I think so. I think it feels to me like one of the biggest one of the easiest political wins in history. Just an absolute open goal, to use a sporting metaphor. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of an issue, including immigration, where what you might call the radical progressive elite are so out of touch with mainstream opinion, so out of touch with it on this issue that I think most ordinary people just cannot get their heads around the fact that this type of thing was ever allowed to happen in the first place, that biological men were ever allowed to compete in women's sports, and that certain authorities, governing bodies of particular sports, turned a blind eye to it and actively encouraged it in some cases, and are still doing so in this country and in other countries. And I'm really not a fan of Trump. I don't like the man as a human being at all, I have to say. But credit where it's due. This is an entirely sensible move, and I think one that ought to be followed, and probably in the long term probably will be followed when common sense returns in a lot of countries. And I think probably we will at some point in the future look back in horror actually at the idea that we did ever let this go on, that it happened because, let's face it, a radical and vocal and politically motivated minority managed to persuade governments and institutions to follow them into fantasy land. That's the truth of it. We would never have allowed this to happen when it came to any other biological characteristic. We would never have allowed people who were not of that biological characteristic to appropriate it for their own ends. And yet women and girls were supposed to go, that's fine. You know, the concept of womanhood is really no more. If you want to be a woman on the basis of your subjective emotions, then that's fine. You're one of us. It's appalling that civilized society has ever allowed that sort of thing to happen. So it's something that Trump has got right.
Yeah, you never. I mean, you don't get people identifying as disabilities, or not yet.
Well,
I mean, the
exactly.
Paralympics never got touched. I don't want to invite it, but there's also this.
Adults identifying as children. Or something,
Yeah.
What was that?
I think one of the interesting things for sport will be how to deal with, and there's lots of female sports women who are sort of calling for clarity around this, about what you do with the. It's quite clear what you do with the men who are pretending to be women, but what do you do with the people who have the complicated biological makeup, which there are quite a few cases, and there have been in the Olympics, there have been in football. And, I'm thinking about all the old articles that Mick Hume ever wrote for Spiked about the Olympics, and how, the exciting thing about elite levels of sport is that it involves a level of freakishness. People are freakishly tall and freakishly fast, and that's the brilliant thing, that there is a kind of a difference. But it's how you institute some kind of test, some kind of policy that just clearly, line in the sand says, this is the acceptable level of difference that will, and then this is where you cross a line, and it becomes too much like a male body in a women's area of sport. And that takes some guts doing that. I mean, it's one thing signing an executive order, but dealing with that issue, which I think is a lot of where the whole kind of unfairness in sport thing happens, will be the next step. And I think it's going to be a really interesting area to watch.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.